first from Bob's comments and other information available to you that Jim Roach had a very fond attachment to Australia. He was on MacArthur's staff during the war out there. He returned to the ANU and was the first master's degree graduate of the program in International Studies at the ANU, which was just starting after World War II. Excuse me. So when we were able in the late 1990s to bring a very prominent Australian to teach here, a man by the name of Ross Terrell, and we were able to bring him in for about 4 years on a repeating basis as a visiting professor from Harvard. Jim was delighted, and he and Ross Terrell formed a very fast friendship, which then continued even after Ross no longer served as a visiting professor here, and so there's a lot of correspondence back and forth, phone calls and so on. They just became very fast friends. And Ross sent me a remembrance of Jim today that he asked me if I couldn't present here tonight. It was a bit long, and I've compressed some of his remembrance, just in interest of time here, but I can make the full thing available, of course, to everyone. So let me just read what Ross said. It's only one page and it won't take very long. My fond memories of UT owe much to Jim Roach's courtesy, steady vision, love of the university, and delight in correspondence. Memories of his time in India and Moynihan's tenure as ambassador in Delhi dotted Jim's letters. Improvement in relations with India under Clinton and Bush delighted Jim. A sad note crept in as he wrote of canceling the annual escape to his beloved Swiss hotel. Parenthetical, you know that he often went, not only often, I think annually went to Switzerland and went hiking in the Alps and had a glorious time there for many, many years. And Ross is saying, sadly, it became apparent that Jim no longer could make those summer trips to Switzerland. A dead battery in his car reminded him of 3 months' non-use of the vehicle. He realized he would not, after all, make a train trip on the new route from Beijing to Tibet. Typewritten letters gave way to handwritten ones on yellow paper, sometimes in red pen. I've emptied my, and here's a quote from Jim, I've emptied my Burdine office, a twinge of loss after 55 years, he wrote with a shaky pen. The library is taking 2,905 books and 30 maps from his office. The letters shone with a sense of the local, a worry about the university bursting its seams, an eagerness to know the latest from Beijing. Ross frequently went to Beijing. Keen attention to political trends in the Midwest after visiting his brother in Iowa. Above all, the letters showed the high value Jim placed on friendship. To me, Jim Roach was a pillar of UT, who burnished the institution in my mind. In retirement, he was a model of the scholar feeling a responsibility to get public policy right, a gentleman of dignity and poise, and a person who set an example for us all. From Ross Terrell, Cambridge, Massachusetts, October 25th, 2010.
There were several other people who wanted to be with us this evening and who could not make it for reasons of health or other obligations, and I'd just like to read a couple of comments that they sent to share with you this evening. This is from Ed Dorn, the former dean of this LBJ school and member of the faculty there. I regret that an out-of-town commitment will keep me from attending the memorial service for Dr. James Roach. Jim was one of my favorite teachers when I was an undergraduate at UT during the mid-1960s. He was one of the few professors who seemed interested in my development and well-being. I hesitate to read this because it doesn't reflect very well on the rest of the faculty. But this is what he wrote, so I'll share it with you. UT was much smaller 40 years ago, but even then it could be cold and impersonal, and for some of us, it was not a welcoming place. Jim was one of the professors, Bill Livingston and the late Carl Leiden were others, who greeted me by name when we passed one another on campus. He encouraged me to attend graduate school, and he supported my application for a Fulbright scholarship. During the spring of my senior year, he treated a small group of us to Sunday brunch. It was the only time during my 4 years here that I shared a meal with a professor. Today, I appreciate Jim's gestures of interest and support even more than I did 40 plus years ago. I learned from him. I hope that some of my students will benefit from the Jim Roach's lessons about kindness. Sincerely, Edwin Dorn. Also, Tom Janussi and his wife send the following note. I appreciate being invited to the memorial service commemorating the life of my dear friend and former colleague, Jim Roach. Jim left a big footprint at the university during his lengthy career. He stimulated his students, inspired many to become specialists in international relations, and maintained correspondence with literally hundreds of students over the years. He recruited faculty, including faculty for other departments of the university, that is me, for the Department of Economics and Asian Studies. He inspired confidence in UT Austin when he served in the embassy of our nation in India, and he was a key figure in the development of Asian studies at the university. My friendship with Jim began in 1956 when Jim and I were in the first cohort of the Ford Foundation Fellows selected to do field research in India, and we were in constant communication as friends and colleagues thereafter until a few weeks before his death when contact could not be sustained. He will be missed by all who had the pleasure of knowing him. Sincerely, F. Thomason Janussi, Professor Emeritus of Economics and Asian Studies. One last small note from Tom Ward, that many of you will know, is a UT government alumnus, a former student of Jim's, and a member of the Liberal Arts Council. Sorry I can't be with you today at the memorial for Jim Roach. He was a wonderful teacher and friend. I was his student in the 1950s, and his course in American foreign policy inspired me to later join the Foreign Service and spend some 20 years of my career in Southeast Asia. I know him as a humble man of great character, and am thankful for his friendship. Tom Ward, Washington, D.C. Now I'd like to take just a few minutes to make some comments of my own. Again, realizing that Jim would have squirmed very uncomfortably if he was able to watch this ceremony himself. And I think my comments, because they come at this point, will echo some you've already heard. I hope it won't be too redundant. Jim Roach was a man of contradictions. He had more friends than just about anyone I've ever known. These friends were his students, colleagues, and a varied assortment of interesting characters that he met at Harvard, in the military, in Washington, Australia, India, and other locales. All these individuals surely met the minimum characteristic required to call him a friend. Over the years, they and Jim carried on regular correspondence, sharing news of marriages, children, divorces, career successes, and failures. When opportunity arose, they made a point of looking him up when they came to town. Whenever Jim was in his office, he could be seen pounding his antique manual typewriter to produce the hundreds of letters he sent annually to the four corners of the globe. I count myself as one of Jim's friends. Though living at close hand, we rarely had occasion to exchange letters. I admired him immensely and treasured the conversations he never denied me when I walked into his office uninvited. But as I said, Jim was a man of contradictions. Although he was at the center of a friendship circle of formidable size, he was nonetheless a solitary man, a private man. As far as I know, from the time he left the military after the war until his death, he always lived alone. If I were asked to identify the most interesting single fact about Jim Roach, I would not cite, as he did at a department party once, the fact that he single-handedly liberated a quite deserted Philippine island while traveling with General MacArthur upon his famous return. A fascinating event, no doubt, but as Jim would surely admit, anyone willing to get his boots wet could wade ashore and plant the American flag to liberate an uninhabited island. Instead, I would point to the following. Jim lived nearly 88 years without ever owning a television set. He lived most of all his life alone, without so much as a dog, cat, or parakeet to keep him company, and had no television to distract him on long weekends or evenings. I know he listened to classical music on KMFA, and we all know that he read. I often wondered how he did it, how he defeated boredom and loneliness. I lived alone for a stretch of some 14 years at one point in my life, and I found it a challenge and have to confess to surrendering all too often to the boob tube and its inane offerings to create the illusion of human contact. Moved by Jim's example, I've often wondered how different I would have been if my parents had banned television when I was a child and I had occupied myself reading books and journals for all those hours I spent staring vacantly at the flickering screen. I might have been a bit more like Jim Roach, and I would have been all to the good, for he was the best informed and most widely read person I ever knew. But I eventually came to the conclusion that Jim was able to avoid the plague of television because he did not experience loneliness, that he relished nothing so much as the prospect of leaving work at 5 p.m. on Friday with the anticipation of being left perfectly alone to sate his voracious appetite for instruction and knowledge until he returned to work on Monday morning. The two key characteristics of Jim's personality were a lifelong impulse to sociability and a fierce protection of his solitude. In the battle between these two impulses, his solitude won out, especially in the last years. He was a difficult man to get close to, at least that was my experience. He seemed genuinely interested in your life, your loves, your triumphs and sorrows, big and small, but he was loath to share with you his own. In the end, this asymmetrical relationship was more than a fair exchange for me, at least. Jim Roach was one of the handful of significant male figures in my life, a role model as a teacher, a source of wisdom as a mentor, and a person from whom I took all the intimacy that he was able and willing to give. I will long remember Jim, as well as my wife Joan, who's with us this evening. And she has the distinction of having taken the government 312L course many years ago that Jim offered. Oops, that's supposed to read not so many years ago. Conveniently, Joan can't remember the grade she earned in that class, but she does remember learning what a cartel was, a concept she has managed somehow to work into the conversation at countless cocktail parties ever since. In doing so, she vindicates the wisdom of the Texas legislature in requiring 6 hours of American and Texas politics to turn generations of Texas undergraduates into informed citizens. When that course was over, Professor Roach flatly refused Jones' request that he supervise an independent reading course, presumably to be devoted to the intricacies of cartels. Generous as he was with his students, Jim was from the old school, and he did not hesitate to tell students no when the circumstances required it.